The white lilies on the coffee table reeked like formaldehyde the moment the door clicked, and the evening entered wearing her perfume and her practiced brightness. And in the same breath, something in the house remembered how to die quietly. The lilies had always bothered the stomach, even before the rot. She called them pure and he called them trumpets, but today they sounded like a procession for the version of them they'd already buried without naming. Her heels announced her like a metronome gone angry, tick, 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 each strike against the hardwood a hammer blow to the thin glass he'd stretched across the day to keep it from spilling. "Honey, I'm home," she sang, too bright, the notes sanding themselves raw against the walls that had memorized their better days. He kept his eyes on the book as if it were an exit wound that might close if stared at long enough, a heavy biography whose pages smelled of old paper and second chances, his thumb fitted to the margin like a last thread. When she drifted closer, holding out the lilies like a white lie in bloom, the air turned dense enough to wade through. "They're beautiful," he lied, and he could hear how smooth the voice had become from years of sanding away splinters before they drew blood. He watched her glide to the coffee table, set the flowers down as if setting down proof she was still the woman he remembered. Dressed the color of summer, hair combed into obedience, smiles stretched across her mouth like cellophane. Then she turned, and the room inhaled sharply. Her gaze found the clean rectangle above the fireplace where a portrait had lived like a shrine to a beginning that had failed to become a life. "Where is it?" she whispered, paint draining from her face until she matched the petals she'd brought to soften a room already bracing for impact. He closed the book with a soft thud that sounded like dirt tossed into a hole and placed it carefully on the table beside the lilies, as if balancing truth and distraction on the same surface. "I took it down," he said, the way one reads a weather report announcing the storm already rattling the windows. "Why?" she asked, heels pacing, tapping out a code neither of them pretended not to understand. "Because a picture is a promise that time agrees to keep," he said, "and this one broke it months ago without apologizing." She flinched, the mask slipping, anger flaring, then extinguishing at the threshold of admission, a candle in a drafty church. "You know," she said, and turned the statement into a question only at the very end, as if there were still a hinge that might hold. "Yes," he answered, and the word had weight, like a stone carried in the mouth across a river that refuses to freeze. Silence arrived then, honest and heavy, and they both sat inside it the way people sit in a waiting room when the doctor already knows. "How long?" she asked, voice thinning to thread. "Long enough," he said, and saw all the ways he could explain himself pass by, the burner phone under the purse lining, the tiny times stamped in the electric blue of the screen. The evenings collapsed into a parole officer's ledger of truth. He had made a cardboard altar to the betrayal. Bank statements and travel itineraries stacked like headstones, glossy photos rubbed raw at the corners by the same two fingers that once traced her collarbone like a prayer. He slid the box across the table, the brown string gave beneath her hands with the softest surrender. She sifted through the paper snowfall, the faces and the dates and the currency of desecration, and each page bleached another inch from her cheeks until she matched her own bouquet. "Everything," he said, and the word lifted its skin to show the bones. Every lie, every door closed against him, every night her phone glowed like a lighthouse for a ship that would never dock here again. "I made a mistake," she sobbed, and the sound cracked like ice at the edge of spring. "No," he said gently, "you made a map and then you followed it." She folded in on herself as if making herself smaller could redraw the distance. "I'm leaving," he told the quiet, and the quiet agreed. He had a bag waiting, a lawyer's letter folded with the clinical tenderness of a hospital sheet, the prenup's language as clean as an incision. The empty wall watched him walk to the door, watched the lilies stiffen, watched the last of their first life drain into the carpet. Outside, the air tasted new, like a word spoken for the first time without permission. Freedom did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived like a coat shrugged off after storm, shoulders rising into their own shape again. Behind him, the house held its breath, and in front of him the road unspooled like a black thread he could follow until the spool ran out or his hands learned they no longer needed to hold. What he wanted stood ahead, a life not built of edits and excuses, but of mornings that did not ask for explanations. What stood in the way was everything he knew how to be when the person he loved required him to disappear. He drove toward a motel sign flickering between letters, vacancy stuttering like a warning or a promise, not sure yet whether he was running from fire or toward light. At the first red light, he finally looked at his hands on the wheel and realized they were steady. At the second, he realized his chest had room for breath. At the third, he realized he was already someone else and the road did not mind at all. He checked into a room that smelled of bleach and old weather, peeled the bedspread back as if unrolling a new beginning, and set the phone face down on the nightstand like a decision. He did not cry. The body sometimes refuses to spill when the heart is still counting the cost. He slept with the TV on mute, moving pictures spilling light across the ceiling like a silent chorus, and dreamed of a white wall above a quiet fireplace where nothing had to prove anything to anyone. In the morning, he bought coffee that tasted like forgiveness only because it was hot and held in both hands. He opened a notes app and typed a sentence that felt like a vow said backward, "Today I do not return." A sparrow landed on the motel railing, cocked its head as if listening, and then took off into a sky that looked brand new for a sky that had always been there. He made a list of everything he would reclaim, his name said in his own voice. His laugh uncoupled from apology, his music too loud on a Sunday, the silence of a morning spent reading a heavy book that asked for nothing. He made a second list of everything he would leave behind, the burner glow, the lilies. The portrait that had convinced them both to keep pretending they were still inside the frame. Then he wrote one more sentence beneath the first, the open loop tightening just enough to keep the blood moving. Today I begin to tell the truth, even when it hurts. The apartment he found on short notice had windows that led in a square of afternoon like a careful promise, and floors that squeaked in welcome every time he crossed them, unaccustomed to a body that didn't apologize for its weight. He bought a cheap table and two chairs he didn't need, arranged them facing each other like a conversation he had not yet learned to have without defending himself. The walls were bare and generous. The blankness did not accuse him of anything. He stacked books along the baseboards, their spines pressed together like siblings after a loss, and tried to remember what it had felt like to read for pleasure without turning pages into alibis. On the second night he cooked pasta and oversalted it and laughed alone genuinely at how the tongue can be surprised by its own mistakes. He texted his sister, who replied immediately with 3 words and a question mark, "You okay?" and a picture of her toddler covered in paint, a small face smiling under a storm of red and blue. He typed the truth, "Not yet." She called and he answered, and the line carried her breath across a city between them the way only love gets to travel, without explaining itself. "Tell me everything or nothing," she said, and he did some of both until the throat loosened and night found the right temperature. After they hung up, the apartment listened to him walk from sink to window and back again, each step a thought finishing itself. He could still hear the past rustle in him like a paper bag, sound without substance, persistent anyway. He kept reaching for the phone and kept stopping, like a reflex relearning its script. On the fourth day, the lawyer called to confirm filings. The sentence, "You will be served within the week," came across as both courtesy and blade. He nodded into the receiver even though the man couldn't see him, as if nodding might keep memory from finding its way back in. When he hung up, he stared at the empty wall as if daring it to confess something on behalf of every wall that had ever watched him endure. That afternoon, he took a walk with no destination, letting the city draft him into its choreography, buses sighing, dogs pulling, a child shrieking at a pigeon as if it were a dragon that could be slain by joy. He ended up outside a gallery he'd never noticed, all concrete and glass and a sign that said open like an invitation to a place where nothing was. Inside, white rooms held paintings that looked like Storm's learning manners. Color fled and returned, and he stood in front of one canvas that looked like someone had tried to stitch a horizon back together with a black thread. A voice beside him said, "It's titled Unkeeping," and he turned to find a woman with a short curl of hair and paint on her knuckles, as if she'd touched the art by accident or on purpose and could not wash off the evidence. "It looks like the moment after a promise leaves the room and the furniture isn't sure where to stand," he said without planning, words arriving in their own shoes. She smiled, not as a preface but as punctuation. "I'm Maya," she said, and offered a hand that wasn't asking for anything. He gave his name, and it sounded right in his mouth, unaccompanied by its usual performance of certainty. Together they stood in the bright quiet the gallery made for them, two strangers sharing a thought without trying to own it. When he left, he carried the title with him, unkeeping, like a folded note in a wallet. A reminder that sometimes the bravest act is to stop holding what has already let go. Back in his apartment, he wrote another sentence, "Today I let the empty space be honest." He taped it to the fridge where it curled a little at the edge, refusing to lie flat. Days gathered like stones, small, weighty, quietly accumulating. He met the morning at the window and named 3 things he could see that did not require him to be anyone. The fire escape ladder like a rib cage, the neighbor's laundry turning into flags, the slice of sky that wouldn't fit into a picture frame. He did not tell anyone except the page that he missed the way she used to drink tea and leave the spoon in the cup, how the spoon would ping against the ceramic when she walked, a small bell announcing her presence like her own private soundtrack. He missed the person he had been before he learned how much he could tolerate. He missed how jokes had landed inside their kitchen like warm bread. He missed being looked at with a brightness that didn't burn. On a rain-struck Tuesday, he opened the cardboard box again, not to cut himself but to make sure he still bled. The glossy photos stared back with the smugness of evidence. He touched none of them, let his eyes skim dates and hotel letterheads and messages truncated at the edges where screenshots had managed the mercy of not capturing everything. He closed the box, tied the string, and wrote, "Today I do not worship at this altar." At night, he remembered the lilies and how their smell had turned the room into a chapel nobody believed in anymore. He imagined returning to the old house in the night, empty as a museum, to stand beneath the blank space where the portrait had hung and say to it, "Thank you for not telling on us sooner." He didn't go, he learned instead how to sit still long enough that the ache could name itself without racing through him like a fire alarm. When the papers were served, his phone lit with a name he knew better than his own. He turned it face down again and listened to the buzzing, each vibration an echo of heels across a floor that was no longer his to clean. Voicemail captured a voice that had once been home. He deleted it without pressing play, a mercy that felt like a betrayal of the part of him that still wanted proof that he mattered enough to be begged. That evening he went back to the gallery. The painting was still there, horizon stitched and unstitched, and Maya stood on a ladder adjusting a light as if moving a sun into place. "Help," she asked, and he steadied the ladder without asking questions, his hands a small whether the ladder could believe in. They talked about unkeeping, about how the body hoards rules it no longer owes anyone. She told him she had left someone 5 years earlier and still sometimes woke with her hand closing on air where a shoulder used to be. "It fades," she said, "but it doesn't apologize," and he nodded because the room in him that understood had opened a window. When he reached his street that night, the sky had cleared with the sudden decisiveness of a mood swing, and the moon looked like it had scraped itself thin to fit between two buildings. He climbed the stairs, thought of his list, added one more sentence. "Today I touched something that did not break." He slept without the TV, and the dark didn't argue. The first letter arrived on a Friday, handwriting he recognized, his name crawling across the envelope as if unsure it was welcome where it was headed. He held it too long without opening it, guilt and curiosity passing the scissors back and forth between them like a dare. He finally slid a blade beneath the flap and unfolded a page creased with intention. "I don't know where to start," she wrote, which was funny because starting had never been their problem, stopping had. She apologized in sentences that knew how to apologize but couldn't convince truth to sign its name at the bottom. She said she was in therapy, that she had learned the words attachment and wound and sabotage, that she could trace her mistakes back to a house with a locked study and a father who taught her love was something earned with silence. She did not write his name, the other man's, as if omitting it could subtract weight from the world. She did not ask for forgiveness, she asked for a meeting, which is sometimes the same request in different clothes. He set the letter beside the sink and watched water bead on the stainless steel like a crowd of tiny decisions refusing to run together. He wrote back, "Not now." He mailed it, and the mailbox swallowed the envelope the way the past swallows all the ways it might have gone differently, with hunger and without comment. He told Maya about the letter, and she didn't tell him what to do. She said, "Say what only you can live with," and he thought about how most advice is just a mirror we tilt until it throws back a face we recognize. At night, the lilies still came, a scent memory uninvited as a ghost at a wedding. He would roll onto his side and breathe through his mouth as if grief had an odor he could avoid. He started running in the mornings because the body sometimes needs to practice leaving and returning until both feel like choices. The city opened a corridor of cold air for him, and his lungs learned to trust that pain with a purpose can be survived. On a run that turned into a walk that turned into a standstill under the highway, he met an old man feeding birds with a careful mathematics, crumbs rationed evenly, palms open like a liturgy. "They fight if you throw too much," the man said, and the sentence went right into a pocket in him, reserved for lines that are both about pigeons and not at all about pigeons. "Moderation," the man said, "is kindness," and laughed, and the laugh sounded like a record that had belonged to someone's mother. He moderated his grief. He let it have mornings and withheld afternoons. Evenings were for anything that didn't require translation. The tight tuck of a bedsheet, the hiss of onions, a song he'd once loved before it had to hold the weight of anything but itself. The second letter arrived with the lawyer's number in the corner and the slash of a deadline drawn across the page. There were terms and terms within terms. There were sentences so polished they reflected nothing. He initialed boxes and signed where arrows pointed, as if following a treasure map to a chest he already knew was full of air. He dreamed one night that he stood again in the old living room, portrait back on the wall, only this time the faces were strangers wearing his mouth and her eyes. He woke with his heart pounding the way a door does when someone wants so badly to be let back and they forget the hinges can only take so much. He got up, made tea, left the spoon in the cup, and walked around until it pinged against porcelain, filling the room with a small music that let him cry finally, privately, completely. Maya painted late sometimes, and he would sit on the floor of the gallery and watch colors dry, an intimacy that did not require speech. "I keep thinking I should be angrier," he told her, and she dipped a brush, considered, said, "Anger is a bridge. You can cross without building a house on it." He nodded and felt the timbers shift beneath his weight, still sturdy, still risky, still the only way from here to there. On the day the decree arrived, folded like origami that refused to become a bird, he held it and felt nothing and then felt everything with a delay, as if the heart had to buffer grief the way a slow internet buffers a video. He set the paper on the table and placed a glass of water on top as if to keep it from flying away. He wrote, "Today I am officially what I have been for months." He walked to the river and stood on the pedestrian bridge where love locks clung to the railings, a swarm of small vows oxidizing toward nothing. He could have thrown his house key into the water in a fit of theatrical cleanliness. Instead, he slid it onto his own ring finger and wore it there for an hour like a joke. He didn't have to explain to anyone. Then he put it back in his pocket and said goodbye to the metal the way one says goodbye to a pet left with a friend, slowly, twice. That night, a third letter arrived, thinner than the others, and inside it only a single photograph. The wedding portrait reprinted small, the two of them looking like people who had borrowed those faces for a day. On the back in her handwriting, one sentence, "I don't know who I was, but I know I hurt you." He didn't reply. He slid the photo beneath the fridge magnet that held his note. "Today I let the empty space be honest," and went to bed where sleep came like a friend on a couch with a blanket and no questions. Months moved the way grief moves when not asked to perform. Not in a straight line, not in spectacles, but in the quiet domesticity of becoming able to breathe while doing the dishes. He could walk past lilies in a flower shop without tasting metal. Sometimes he even leaned in and let the scent be just a scent and not a verdict. The empty wall inside him learned to be gallery white and not morgue white. The difference was everything and also impossible to explain. He and Maya learned each other the way one learns a city, by walking it at different times of day until the light stops surprising and starts revealing. They did not call what hovered between them by any name for a while, which is its own kind of honesty. When they finally kissed, it was not a fireworks display but the first match struck in a dark room where someone is building a shelter. Then came the message from a number he did not recognize, stating simply, "Hospital, she asked for you." His body made the choice faster than the thoughts could arrive to explain or argue with it. He was already on the train, already counting stops, already rehearsing the script of a person who attends without surrendering. In the bright corridor smell of antiseptic and worry, he found her smaller than he remembered, not in size but in manner, as if the illness had been a tailor measuring her for a new humility. "I didn't know who else to call," she said, and the apology was finally not an argument for her goodness but a description of her loneliness. He sat, and the chair scraped a note across the floor that sounded like a chord a guitarist hits once before a song. "What happened?" he asked, and she told him about the rupture, about the emergency, about how the body sometimes runs out of deferrals and insists on settlement. He listened because listening had once been his profession. Now it could be a gift he chose to give without invoice. She did not ask for him back. She asked him to tell her story about a day when they were happy, and he did not have to try hard to choose one. He described the time the power went out during a storm and they played cards by candlelight, how the candles made their faces look like art, how they had both cheated shamelessly and laughed until the dark forgot its job. She cried in the soundless way people cry when they are afraid movement will tear something delicate. He handed her water and adjusted the blanket and let the memory land without making it work to prove anything. When visiting hours ended, he stood and she said, "Thank you for showing up." On the train back, the city rolled by with its usual indifference to personal plotlines, and he felt something unclench, the old knot of wanting to be needed because that was the only way to be loved. He realized he had shown up not out of obligation or habit, but out of a quiet kindness that did not require him to become a sacrifice. The difference was the door through which his life could walk without looking back to see if anyone approved. He wrote on the fridge note, "Today I chose mercy that did not cost me myself." When he told Maya where he had been, she nodded and said, "That sounds like you," not as a sentence about virtue but as an observation about alignment. He didn't know when his life had slipped from damage control into design, only that the edges had stopped cutting him when he handled them. One evening, he returned to the old house not to haunt it, but to retrieve a box of books the lawyer had arranged for him to collect. The porch light came on with its old habit, and the air on the threshold felt like memory turned into weather, present, not punitive. She answered the door leaning on a cane she didn't make a drama of. They looked at each other like people who had survived a shared wreck from different seats. "The picture," she said, glancing toward the empty rectangle above the fireplace, "I never hung anything there." "Good," he said, and did not mean it as a rebuke but as a recognition that some blanks deserve their acreage. He picked up the box, and a book slid to the top, Lincoln again, the same heavy spine he'd set down beside Lily's that day. "Do you hate me?" she asked, voice almost conversational, the way people speak when they are testing if they can hold a truth without drowning. "No," he said, and was surprised to discover that the word, at last, did not require him to pretend. "I don't hate you, I hate what we made each other into." She nodded, and in her eyes he saw a person still sorting, still bleeding in slow, manageable ways, still learning the difference between contrition and transformation. "I'm trying," she said. "I know," he answered, and it was enough because it was not a promissory note, only a receipt for effort rendered. Outside, the evening held its breath and then exhaled as if the sky had been waiting for someone to say exactly that. He walked away carrying weight that did not hurt, the kind of weight a life has when it includes what it includes on purpose. He passed a florist closing shop, the display cart still out, white lilies among cheaper blooms, and he stopped. He bought a single stem and carried it home like a truce between the senses and the story. In the apartment, he cut the stem at an angle and set the lily in a glass of water on the sill where the light could find it without interrogation. He stood and looked at it without turning it into a metaphor, the way one regards a mountain or a sleeping child, as something that does not need the witness to become real. Maya came by, kissed his cheek, looked at the flower, and grinned. "You and your symbols," she teased, gentle, and he laughed because the symbol didn't own the moment. He did. They sat at the table that had waited so long to be used for conversation that wasn't a negotiation, and they ate soup that had learned how to be comfort without overpromising. Later, he stood at the window and watched the city dress for night, lights pulling on their small gowns, and felt the room around him settle into a shape that would not collapse if someone left abruptly. He took the note from the fridge and wrote the last sentence it would need for a while. "Today I kept what keeps me." He taped it back, edges still refusing to lie perfectly flat, as if reminding him that even the most honest declarations curl a little where air can get in. Before bed, he pulled one more box from under the couch, the cardboard altar he hadn't yet dismantled, and carried it to the trash chute. He opened the lid and looked one last time at the evidence of a life that had taught him what his boundaries were by crushing them, then whispered, "Thank you for your service," not as sarcasm, but as a benediction for the tools a person outgrows. He let the box go and listened to it slide into the dark mouth and away, a sound like a book closing in a quiet library. Back in the kitchen, the lily stood in its clear water, a white flare in soft citylite, and for once he didn't imagine trumpets or funerals or anything with a capital letter. He just saw a flower being a flower while a man being a man filled a glass, turned off a lamp, and walked toward sleep with a heart no longer negotiating for its life. And the clean wall inside him, the one where the portrait had hung, held its whiteness like a future that had learned how to be blank without being empty. Learned how to be blank without being empty.